Would love to know where everybody is calling in from today. So if you want to go ahead in the chat and just tell us what company you're a part of, maybe what your role is, and then where you're joining us from. Jersey. Montreal, so we're officially international today. I like it.
Yeah.
Michigan crew. All right, well, I will keep letting people in as I see them pop up, but we are going to kick things off because I think we've got a lot to talk about over the course of the next hour. But first off, thank you all so much for joining us today in our Ask Me Anything session around rethinking performance, what's working and what's not. This is certainly the time of year that we are starting to think about what does performance look like within our organizations for 2025. Hopefully we've already been thinking about that a little bit, but certainly the sense of urgency is ramping up at this point. So we wanted to bring on two experts in this area that certainly have a lot of opinions and thoughts about how to help all of you. So thank you for joining us today. And thank you to Shrikant Chellappa from Engagedly, the CEO and co-founder, as well as Drew Fortin, the CEO of Lever Talent. So I'll let you both introduce yourselves here quickly to our great audience.
Great. Thanks, Amy. It's a pleasure to be on here. I really like talking about performance management. No, I'm just kidding. It's one of those subjects that we enjoy beating up on, but it's also one of those things we need to do. Just a quick background about myself. I am the CEO, co-founder of Engagedly. We started Engagedly to really build high performance, highly engaged workplaces where people, aspirations, and organizational strategy comes together. My background before this was I ran a IT services firm for 9 years, grew that to almost 2,000 people. And then prior to that, I was in Big Four consulting and did a lot of work with lots of clients all over the country. So I spent a lot of time in other organizational cultures, which informed my perspective on engagement and driving better team outcomes. So that's a little bit about me.
Great. Thank you for having me, Amy. Great to be here, Shri, and participating alongside you. My name is Drew, founder and CEO at Lever Talent. We're a talent strategy agency. We help leaders like you find leverage in themselves, their teams, and their strategies by implementing HR tech to help them scale and really align their talent with their strategy. A little bit about me. I have 20 years of corporate management experience. I'm a go-to-market strategist and visionary leader by trade. Worked in many different industries: retail, e-commerce, marketing technology, HR technology, local media and advertising before founding Lever Talent. And ultimately, what led me to doing that is I have a passion for helping people realize that they're capable of much more than they could ever think. And really delighted to be a part of this conversation because I think that's what we want to do with performance management, but we just can't find a way to do it. And so really curious to hear what the questions are from the group today and engage in the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you both for your introductions. And I think that's what's going to be so exciting about the conversation today, because knowing you both, I do know how passionate you are about employee experience. And you're always looking for ways to highlight opportunities for organizations to really grow and develop in that area. So while we might start on a few of the things that are wrong, we're definitely going to get to all of the things that are moving in the right direction too. Just for today's call, we are going to kick it off with one kind of introductory question. but this is all about all of you. So we definitely want you to turn on your cameras or put the questions in the chat, but feel free to guide this conversation with us. So with that said, let's start about where we're at today. What is wrong with the land of performance reviews? And Shri, if you kind of want to kick us off with that.
Shri, you're on mute, by
Yep,
the
you're
way.
muted.
Thank you. I was saying that I was just astounded by how much performance management is hated by people, but also how ineffective it is in many ways, in many places, right? So for example, let's look at some studies. I'm just going to rattle these off, right? So a study by McKinsey found that women and underrepresented groups are 29% less likely to receive positive feedback tied to business outcomes. And 61% of the employees believe that the reviews are influenced by unfair biases on managers' overall perception. A Deloitte study revealed that 58% of the managers admit to rating employees based on their personal standard rather than a defined company criteria. And Sherm did a research that said 62% of employees feel that performance ratings vary too widely between managers, even for similar roles. And only 14% of employees strongly agree that their performance reviews inspire them to improve. That's only 14% who agree. That means it's 86% who don't. 74% of employees feel uncertain about how to improve after their reviews. 42% of the employees felt demoralized after receiving performance ratings, regardless of the score. And Adobe found that 22% of employees have cried after a performance review tied heavily to ratings. So this is just on and on, right? I can keep going. There's 20 more stats here. But the point is this, right? It overwhelmingly, a lot of places, performance reviews suck. And our role as leader is to unsuckify that. And that's really what this discussion is about. So I think with that, I would maybe, start off with just one question. What is wrong with performance reviews in your view, Drew, today? Broadly speaking, why is it? I mean, the only people getting worse ratings than performance reviews is probably the congressman.
Mm-hmm.
So why is that?
It's turned into a ceremony that we have to do to understand how much more we're going to make. And I think there's been a lot of great effort over the last decade, really. There's been so much effort around how do we divorce ourselves from the performance management process, but it still is that. And so, if we were to say, why is it so sucky? To me, I think about leading versus lagging indicators. And there's no more lagging indicator than the ratings you're going to get on your performance review. But a lot of businesses don't do much of anything else. And I think that's why we're in the mess we're in.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that resonate with you, Shri, or would you
Yeah, it does. The one question I have, and this has been the one that stumps a lot of leaders, and I'm not saying it stumps me in many ways, because I actually have a view on this, but I'll come to that in a minute. But how do people, and leaders typically, like, how do I determine who gets a raise and how much raise to give, right? How do you determine compensation in that case?
Well, it begs the question, why should they be tied together?
That's my point. If
how
they
many
don't
people on
tie
this
together,
call?
then I don't know how to give a raise. Go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to say, I'm curious how many people on the call, and you can either use like the little hand raise or just speak up, have performance tied to compensation within your organizations today. Yeah, a few. Actually would have expected a few more. But I think that is kind of the old school way of thinking, right? Is that that's the only time of year that we look at compensation is when we're doing performance evaluations. Why do you think that they should be tied together? Or do we think that there's better outcomes if we don't do that?
I think it's a record. So a performance review is if anything, it should be your greatest hits throughout the year. And I would think that we should all aspire to, you shouldn't be surprised what's going to be on your performance review. And if you're a leader that's providing something that is going to be a surprise or is a shock on a performance review, then you're a bad leader. And I think that if that's what it is that record, and in a lot of businesses, it actually protects the business from a legal standpoint to say, we now have on record a performance document, at least annually, we have one performance document. It protects them in litigation. That's ultimately where it stems from. And so if we want to keep it there, then I do think we have to divorce it from compensation. I do think that understanding how well you're performing absolutely should determine your value. But again, I don't think that should be the determinant ultimately, that you have a performance review and that's it. You could have an annual cycle. We have job classifications, job rating scales, other performance criteria that I think we could make more clear to our employees so they could understand what knowledge, skills, or performance goals or metrics that they have to hit in order to achieve those. And I think the premise is the new age way of thinking over the last decade that we've come to realize is that more feedback, more often, more checking in, and more understanding is the way to get there. I worked at a company where we actually, on the annual basis, asked the employee what they thought they would qualify for a merit increase. And then we asked their supervisor. But that was the ongoing thing. And if what the employee asked for was, we would take the higher of the two. And that would be the most strongly weighted, because there should be no surprise again. And it's more so, to me, compensation should be a celebration of the value of the individual.
Teacher probably across.
Yeah.
I think that there still is very much performance seen as like a check the box exercise.
100%.
So it's not really thought about until it's due. And therefore you do get maybe less thoughtful input. How do we move beyond that? How do we make performance more than just a once a year exercise, more than just a check the box part of our role?
So I think the main thing that I like to emphasize here is that the once a year performance reviews are not necessarily a bad thing, but it gets bad if that's the only thing you're doing. So it could be a summarization and a reflection of what you've done all year, and summarization
Love
and
that.
reflection of all the conversations,
Mhm.
and a discussion for development and growth thereafter. If you want to do that way, that's one way to do it. But what really needs to happen is clear expectation setting throughout the year. And it can change depending on the type of work you're in. In many startups, things change very fast, so we do it quarterly basis. In some organizations, a year or multi-year way of setting objectives might work. If you're working for a big oil company, maybe you can't really measure performance in a quarterly basis. Maybe you need to think multi-year, right? But if you're working for a tech startup or another smaller company, then you might have more frequent discussion. In some cases, I've come across companies where they do a daily review of the work the day before, and then talk about the work they need to do the next day. And that could be something like a restaurant business, for example, right? And so it needs to be frequency based on what type of work you're doing, the industry you're in, and it needs to be more frequent. I think the one thing that I would say that companies and people and managers, especially new managers, really suffer from is the inability or the fear of getting candid feedback.
Mhm.
People are afraid to offend their people that report into them. And I think if given correctly and without being personal about it, right? You need to divorce the personality from the activity and focus on the activity and say feedback is about the activity. It's not about you personally, right? And I think if you do that more frequent basis, it needs to happen all throughout the year. So then, as Drew said, when you come to the performance reviews, it shouldn't be a surprise.
Shri, tell me why you think that there's fear of giving constructive feedback.
Because people like to be liked. That's just human nature. We don't want to be disliked. And I think human nature allows us to skirt around, and especially we talk about subtly. Like, for example, I'll give an example, right? If you say, it's a little challenging to or let me just say, let's say your performance could be a little bit more refined. That's a subtle way of saying that you need to do better. But if you say something like that, then you're really not giving good feedback because you're not being specific about it. But you're also trying to avert, the main issue here, because you don't want to offend that person. I think that's, generally speaking, a characteristic that takes a little bit of time. And talk about the concept of radical candor and things like that.
Sure.
I think things can change that, but that's a behavior change. But it also comes from trust, that when people trust you, that your feedback is really meant to improve their work and not necessarily to, put points on the board where you say, hey, you have 3 strikes and you're out. I think that makes a difference.
Sure.
I can also chime in here too. I think it's important too to make sure you like set that standard ahead of time and like ask people like what their perceived method of feedback is. I've went through situations in the past where feedback is shared via chat or via email, and sometimes it can be derived in a completely different manner than how the person giving it to you meant it. So I think it's important to have that conversation around like how you perceive it and what the importance of it is, and how that person can take it before just sharing about the feedback, and it might not be super valuable.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great point, Caroline. Where I come from at Shri is the moment that we attach feedback to compensation, reward, is the moment that we just totally crater true opportunity to have someone unlock their potential. Because the moment that to give constructive feedback is therefore to take out of, in this case, we talk about it as merit earning, away from their wallet. And I think that it's unfortunate that in business society today, that is kind of how we're introduced to feedback, versus I think the moment that we can actually divorce the constructive feedback from that, I totally agree with everything that you're saying, which means that we need more venues and we need more license inside business to really subscribe to the Marshall Goldsmith version of not feedback, but feed forward. And if I knew that my team and my supervisor were with me beginning of the year, giving me feedback, because that's only going to make me stronger and make me better and actually result in me earning more, and my earning, by the way, is a direct correlation to the value I perceive I'm providing to the company and the company perceives they're getting from me. That's winning. The other component that you bring up too is, I think is really poignant, is no one is trained often how to do performance review or give feedback. We just throw them into it. And then we wonder why we get the bad result. We can practice this stuff. We can level set on this stuff. And we have tools like Engagedly that can actually help us codify a system, train people on that, and get really great results from it.
I think that's a huge point right there, Drew, about not being trained. We typically promote people into like manager level positions because they're so good at the job that they do, right? They're great at executing a role. They're not necessarily a great leader. And so we thrust them into that role without giving them the tools and resources to really set them up for success. And one of the things I've done with, training people in that leadership position is to remind them that feedback is a sign of respect. If you're not willing to tell someone what they can do differently and better and contribute in different ways to the organization, to me, that's not showing any value to them, right? You don't care enough to take the time to really highlight those opportunities and help them grow in their role. And so I think when you can lay that foundational piece out for people too, that helps them have those conversations more frequently even. But I love your feed forward instead of feedback.
Yeah.
So Drew, I have a question coming back to the compensation again.
Yeah.
If, and I don't think we fully finished that conversation. So if we, I agree that we should not tie compensation
Yep.
discussion directly right after performance reviews, because then it becomes
Yeah.
attached, and then it's expected going forward every single time. What is the mechanism then you suggest is the best way to do compensation reviews then?
You said compensation review. I just want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
compensation changes or reviews.
Sure. I'm a big proponent of the, philosophy of let's take compensation off the table. And so I like to think in a lot of ways right now in business, especially in the US, we're really strongly leaning into this notion of at-will employment. That benefits the business way more than it benefits the individual. I'm sorry. But if we actually had more conversation about this is what I think you're worth now, and this is where I think you can go in the next couple of years, I don't think we should be having conversations about annual compensation. I think we should be having conversation about the person's trajectory and tenure here and what that would mean from a compensation standpoint. And so just like you would have an annual performance review, I would think you would want to at least have an annual compensation review at the very minimum. But I also subscribe to the notion of providing much more security and forwardness with the individual. So imagine a world where if you are actually talking about a 2-year trajectory with an employee, why wouldn't you talk to them about a 2-year employment contract and compensation timeline? Why wouldn't you actually show them you can expect an X% increase next year and an X% increase the year after that? Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we have that conversation? This is what I mean by taking it off the table, which is, sure, you should have it regularly, but have that conversation separately. If the performance review is the lagging indicator on the year, then the compensation plan is the lagging indicator on the person's tenure to this point. And then I do think there should be better conversations and commitment about moving forward. This is something that I've talked to businesses about, and I'm even testing with my own agency, is the notion of actually having someone engage in a 2+ year contract, which puts me on the hook, by the way, to pre-negotiate severance. God forbid something were to happen. To have this conversation and make that the minimum viable negotiated compensation model, everything fully loaded, comp and benefits, that we would provide for you, because I think you're awesome. And I don't think we look at it that way. I think there are many businesses that are like, this is a negotiation. You're going to ask for 20% more than I'm going to give you. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to feel good because I won $500 more. And it means nothing to my business, by the way, but everything to you. And that's, that I think that's ultimately where I come out on it. But to answer your question point blank, at least an annual conversation about compensation should be separate from performance review. Maybe make them off year, like the performance review is a quarter before or something like that, but not tied to.
I think another way to look at that too is if you're doing them combined, if I'm getting a lot of constructive feedback, now I have to wait a whole year to see the outcome of that, right? If I go and take immediate action, in 3 months, I'm absolutely crushing it. I'm not going to get any value from that for 9 more months. So having those off cycle gives me the opportunity to hear that and do something with it and hopefully gain that promotion that I'm seeking.
Yes. And Amy, again, the way that I would look at it is you should be having, and I think Sri subscribes to this as well, a regular, more frequent professional or personal development conversation. That's about nothing else than how are you doing in your role? How are you doing on your career track? How are you doing with controlling your behaviors, good, bad, ugly, and what value do we think you're adding to the business right now since the last time we spoke? Those conversations, if going really well, can sometimes lead to a spot bonus, a change in compensation, a promotion sooner. And so I don't think we should look at a comp review or performance review as anything more than the minimum viable that has to happen.
Yeah. So there's one thing that I emphasize a lot is performance reviews and performance management are two different things,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And when people interchangeably use it, performance management is about driving and getting better performance in your organization across all your teams and with your team member. Performance review is a point in time of assessment. That's all it is. It's a point in time assessment. You can do it every quarter. You can do it once a year. Maybe you do it once every 2 years. There's no science behind how often you do it. Like I said, it's industry to industry, role to role. It all depends on that. And people mix the two. So when you say, what do you do for performance management? They say, we do once a year reviews. Wrong answer. Wrong answer. The answer is, what do you do for performance management? The question really is, what are you doing to drive better performance within your teams? And I think that's where
Yeah. Yeah. And I think
component of it, these development discussions are a component of it. Training is one component of it. Celebrating successes is one component of it. Building better teams where people are aligned to their strengths and skills, using things like predictive index is a component of it. All of those put together is your performance management process. Sorry, go ahead, Drew, you were saying something.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Your performance management is like the whole experience of performance. If we talk about performance review, it's just that record annually. And so I couldn't agree more with that. I think when we think about performance management, this is where I think the business really needs to not take advice from what's being done in the field. What are people measuring? We need to really get right and tight on our mission, our vision, our values as an organization, our strategic plan, what adaptation, what transformation really needs to happen. And we need to get super clear on what winning looks like as a company. And then how do we translate that down into performance criteria for the individuals? Then we can talk about, okay, what are the tried and true methods for checking in on individuals, coaching individuals, training individuals, tracking progress, measuring progress. To me, it doesn't look all that different from running a very standard annual, quarterly, monthly OKR process, but think about it through the lens of how do we take that and translate it to performance measurement and management.
Before we shift any gears, the topic of preparing managers to give performance conversations definitely struck a chord with a couple of attendees. Holly and Maria both asked questions around how do we train them? Do you have any recommendations on how to level up our managers?
Absolutely. What we notice at Lever Talent, we do a lot of training that is governed by the business strategy, by mission, vision, values definition. And I don't care what level of supervisor or manager you are at, there's always going to be a certain level of what I call working on the business versus working in the business. And I think the moment that you are supervising someone, you assume the obligation to improve them. And if we start to adopt that methodology, then we think, how can I ensure that this person knows that I have their best interest in mind? They trust me. And then how can I be sure that they're getting what they need in order to succeed? And to me, that comes in two different ways. The first one is appreciation. I don't think we do enough training of our managers to give them the practice on how to show appreciation. Good job is not showing appreciation. But Amy, the fact that you pulled together this AMA, you have your list of questions, you're moderating the chat. It feels like a really solid event. That's something you're clearly great at. I don't think I could do that. We're talking specifically about a moment in time, showing appreciation for your unique abilities. That is filling a cup time after time after time and giving you license in the future to say, hey, you know how we talked about that thing? Well, you just did another AMA and it didn't go so well. I'm wondering why. You've demonstrated, right? Let's talk through it. Is there something going on? Has something changed? We don't provide that opportunity enough. And I'm a simpleton, but when it comes to training individuals to do this, for instance, what we provide literally is we help businesses and we do a values-based leadership training. And we give managers that rep time to practice those muscles of delivering feedback that is specific, that is constructive, and most importantly, and you get the check plus if you actually are able to integrate the core values of the business. Here we celebrate the fact that we're game changers, and you just went out on a limb and tried something new, doing X, Y, and Z. That was awesome. Now what we're doing is codifying the behavior, practicing the behavior, and demonstrating amongst peers what behavior is going to be celebrated. And time again, more people are going to do that.
Yeah, talking about this question that somebody asked about how to give good feedback, there is this framework that we like and we use in Engagely as well, called SBI framework: situation, behavior, impact. So if you Google it, you can find more detail about it as well. It's basically, instead of saying, like you said, hey, you did a good job, or you could have done better, that's not good feedback. Neither of them are, because it doesn't follow something like a situation SBI framework, which is situation. You describe the situation, how that behavior of you either positively or negatively impacted, and then that's your impact. So you talk about that in that construct. That is more specific feedback that you can give, because then you're really removing the individual, so they don't take it personally. You just say, this aspect of the work that you did here had this negative or a positive impact on the situation. And that makes it clear, a more objective way of giving feedback.
Yeah.
But I would say an SBI type of training and framework within the organization would be a great one to give. The other thing that, going back to the manager role, one of the things that I like to talk about a lot is managers. You don't necessarily manage, you don't manage people. It's a really, I'm not a big fan of that whole concept of I'm managing these people. We want to give people agency in their work life. What we are really doing is trying to figure out how to put the right team together so that the outcomes are the most optimal with any right process. So the manager's role, in my view, and I would agree, I would think you would agree with this as well, Drew, is that of a coach, right? The manager is more of a coach, figuring out what do I need to provide this team so that they can win championships.
Yes. I think that a lot of times, if we want to use the sports analogy, you have a general manager, you have a coach, and then you have specific coaches for different things. And so you have this organization that's built around getting that team to perform at its best. So 100%, I think more and more the role of coach is a hat that managers have to put on. I think sometimes we can get confused when, depending on the situation, all right, am I putting on my manager hat? Am I putting on my mentor hat? Am I putting on my coach hat? And coaching is really about, like, hey, let's talk about your swing. How did it go? You missed, but this was up here and this was down there. And it's like, okay, now I feel like the person feels like they're improving. Mentorship is more about sharing our own experiences and helping guide them along the way and giving them support in such a way that's like, oh yeah, we are going to fall down sometimes, but we can pick ourselves back up. And then that management component, there are times where we have to be like, okay, we have to make a decision. The clock's ticking. We're going to have to jump in here and do these things. But I think if managers could get better at clarifying for the individual they're working with when that moment is, well, we're going to have more impact. And of course, I agree, as I said at the beginning, the coaching element, maybe it's not that the leader street needs to turn into a coach because that's the new thing today. It's just that because of the type of work we're doing, we're relying more on humans for their human ability and humaning at work, that the coaching element is now needed so much more. Because it's no longer like you built the trinket or doodad wrong. It's like, oh, we made this decision about to go in this direction and it didn't work. And that's like almost like there's a lot of a gray area there. And so I think the coaching is therefore more critical.
Yeah, that's great. And Melinda, thank you for your book recommendation. If everybody saw that, she had a good book that works for her organization. Something that's near and dear to my heart is the kind of the gap between what happens with deskless workers and desk-bound employees, and how they are not often treated the same way in organizations in a lot of different HR strategies, but I think performance is definitely one of them. So I'm curious, Drew, if you want to kick us off here, why do you think this gap exists? And how do we help to create performance management for that frontline workforce that equals what we have been doing for years for our desk-bound teams?
Can you clarify?
Or should they be equal? I think that's a question too. Should they be similar, or should they be different strategies because they're different groups of employees?
Sure. Another way to talk about this is field workers versus, right?
Yes.
Should they have different performance criteria? Absolutely. Right? Clearly, when you have someone in the field, you're trusting and relying on them in a way. I always say, like, great management is what your people do when you're not there. And I think the imperative then is, what are mechanisms we could use to actually measure productivity, performance, creation are very different in that world than sitting behind a desk and being part of the culture and environment. Also, there's this notion of like recency, proximity bias that I think plays into that. And so I think the imperative then is, if you have a business that has any field folks, is really to be upfront and as clear as possible about the performance measurement system. And you almost need to have a decree that says, because of this, the minimum viable is going to be what we measure in the field, or we're going to be field first, right? Those elements are going to be needed in order to maintain that trust, because if not, you're going to run into the problem that we're running in today. And just one more clarification, Amy, when you think about this gap, are you talking about it as like the field versus deskless, or is it like we have remote workers working at home and then we have some people in the office?
I'm thinking more of your frontline teams. So employees working on the manufacturing line, on the line in the restaurant versus those in the corporate office.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Whether that's remote or in office environment.
Yep. We're on the same page there. Shri, what are your thoughts on this?
You know, that's a tough one, because the frontline workers, they're measured really on KPIs, like how many widgets did you put together today, or what was your total number of tables you served in your shift, or I used to work for FedEx back in the day, and the drivers were comped and measured on how many packages they delivered per hour, and metrics around that, and there was like a minimum threshold with that's how their performance was, which is, I guess, necessary, but not sufficient. Because I think you are not measuring, you're measuring the productivity, but performance can be how are they they are just like people feel happier, and it's like generally more so there are all these other aspects that can to me is where the gap. And I don't know if I'm not saying it's not promoting but I think there is some X factor, this soft factor of performance management that is somehow missed. I believe, we have systems in place where we can give each other I have that when you track observing them, because this person is out of the system is out doing more delivering goods. They're not surprised that has no clue how that person is interacting with their customers, how they're interacting with their teammates, when they packages. aspects that you can capture into some systematic fashion, whether it's through like the ones we have, engaging with the employee or other mechanisms, I think they need to be taken into consideration as well.
Yeah. There's there's a conversion that has to happen. Again, if you have this macro level, if you have like the company's strategy and strategic outcomes you're looking to achieve, and you have the values of the business, I think you owe it to the business to be able to map those. I worked in retail when I started my career and managed stores for Staples, and worked in the field for a few years, and then worked in the main office. And it was very much that element. And where I was going with like the minimum viable or the tone that you have to set in a lot of these cultures, any business that has a field or manufacturing, and Amy, you said like front line, you're like the closest to the delivery of said product. It's that team that is probably the most critical. And we got to figure out a way that in performance management, we're also tying in those elements of culture and of measuring that. And Sri, I think your point about individuals and what magic they bring, unfortunately, in the manufacturing facility, or even out in the field, we're not going to be able to see those moments as much. So we almost have to rely more on the word of mouth of others. And I look at this as a win for AI coming. Because if we can be more open sourced or open text field about feedback, but we can use AI to start to actually codify said feedback, process said feedback, and align it to our models, I actually think we'll be able to bring these two worlds of field and office closer together.
I do want to add one thing to what you just said, which not elaborate, not necessarily add to what you
sure.
said. So what you said makes a lot of sense. So what I was saying is that, how the metrics become the necessary components of performance, not sufficient. The sufficient part, I think, comes in from values. So if you have a good value structure in your organization, where you value, for example, I don't know, if you're a service-oriented organization, maybe you put a lot of value on customer service and customer delight and things like that. If you can measure those things effectively, whether using AI or some other mechanisms of measuring and measuring sentiment tools, which I don't think a lot of organizations do that well either, but also measuring your interaction with your peers, because a lot of values are around teamwork and respect and things of this nature. So if you're getting those feedback as well on an active basis, then you're really eliminating that manager bias that we were talking about earlier. Because the manager is going to be very biased, and it doesn't matter. The manager could be a superstar manager, but they still have the bias because they only can assess what they observe. They don't know what they don't know. And
right.
to really fill that gap there, we need these assessment or these tools that gives these indicators of performance on those values from other sources. Yeah. They can assess your productivity because those KPIs are tracked actively by all these companies. These companies are really good at tracking these KPIs, not good at tracking values.
So here, I have a question. How do we stop screwing it up? So what you're talking about, I'm like, great, we're going to develop this system so we can get the field-based people entering some stuff. And then it's like the moment we create the process, it becomes the thing that we have to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on like, how do we help the process versus we're like, oh, we built a data collection mechanism in order. Yeah, I think that's often where it falls. And like
then that becomes a KPI tracking mechanism itself. Yeah. Yes, and I actually have an answer for you on that one. The magic word is gamification. I think you gamify behaviors. So if you gamify these behaviors where it is completely discretionary, there is no penalty for not getting those points, but there is value in getting those points, and you can get those points in many different ways, right? For example, you can gamify behaviors where if you praise someone else, the person getting praised obviously is the subject of that point, if you will, or the gamification. but the person giving praise has to be also be celebrated for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You gamify that behavior. You're gamifying the behavior of not just getting the praise, but actually giving the praise. I think that's where, and you were talking about earlier, how we don't praise enough in many organizations. We are stingy with it. And I think if you gamify those behaviors without having any kind of tracking mechanism or KPI, if you just do that, and that can give you insight into what values are being celebrated. Maybe your values are what you put on a poster board on your shop floor, yeah, but the values that you actually see being celebrated may be completely different. Maybe that's time to reevaluate your values at the point again.
Right. I think we're stingy because we all have this varying level of not liking our jobs.
Yeah, you don't lose appreciation points by giving it away.
Right.
Yeah. It's free. You keep giving it and you still have it.
We are pretty much on time here, but I want to open it up quickly. If you didn't already put a question in the chat and you have something pressing that you want to share with Drew and Shri, this is the time. Come off mute or go ahead and put that into the chat. Lots of great takeaways from this conversation, including my favorite quote of how we unsuckify performance. Be using that going forward. But also, I think a big one for me is around the talking to companies about not tying performance to compensation and the value that can bring of separating those two things. Other key takeaways from people on the call today. All right. Any final thoughts, Drew or Shri? Oh, and Valerie did just come in with a question here.
Oh,
in rating performance,
but I didn't get a chance. So, rating scales. Drew, what are your thoughts there?
It depends, right? And so, like, I worked with clients that have rating scales that actually rate with a 360. I don't agree with the process, but they rate that way. I've worked with organizations that use a checklist methodology. So if we have items scored against our strategic goals or outcomes and said checkbox, you get more points. I think the most common is the Likert scale with the various components about job performance. I think we can probably spend a little more time thinking beyond that to what is a rating scale that's going to benefit us. But my story will always be, it depends. And there is one that you can absolutely customize and configure for your culture that works. And I think I would definitely just urge people more often than not to just take an idea, but to work with a piece of technology or to work with a professional or somebody that's done it enough that could actually help you come up with the performance management plan and the resulting rating scale to get there. Shri, do you have one that you love and you're like, everyone should do?
I don't have any I love, but I'm not necessarily against rating scale either.
Exactly.
I don't have a good answer on that one, unfortunately. Because the ideal rating scale, we've all used to 5-point. I lived 5-point for a lot of my life. I actually like a 3-point scale better, where you either don't meet, you meet, and you exceed. That's it. All three, just those three. But the problem with that is people, when they get a meet, they think they got a bad rating, and that's not true. A meet means you actually are meeting, and if you meet all the job performance requirements, I think you're a star. But the point is, if you give everybody people a 2 in this case across the board, they think they underperformed, and then there's a big argument with the manager. So that's the problem.
Well, that's the other thing, right? Is training people on the actual rating scale itself. And I love what Murray said here, which is each person is different. There absolutely should be a behavioral component when we're thinking about performance evaluation, is how well are you maximizing your own self-awareness, your behavioral superpowers to impact your role and the company. What that requires, though, is that we all have that understanding and some sort of mechanism to measure that. I think that's
So Mary's question about how do we customize a performance review per person so it's not something that's universal. Actually, the one way to do that is to use goals and values, right? So if you use goals, and the goals are very specific to that person. You know, if you're in enterprise sales versus mid-market sales, maybe you're selling services versus product, you will have different goals. And maybe if you're selling something in America versus Canada, you'll have different goals. The buying behaviors are different, and all of those things can be different. So if you have specific goals, and then you just rate them on the goals separately, but the values still need to be consistent, because your values are how your culture is defined. So I'm a big fan of, if you're going to do a rating, it needs to be both, goals and the values.
Yes.
It can't just be the values. It can't just be the goals. It has to be both.
Yeah. And sure, you bring up a good point, which is in a lot of businesses, we have really well thought out job descriptions, but more often than not, there's not a standardized or specific set of performance criteria that should ride along with that job description. And then we may actually have a better way in any performance management process to measure and evaluate. Because whether or not someone achieved you're responsible for X, Y, and Z, that's a binary thought. Did you do it? Did you not? Or maybe a Likert scale. But if we actually had performance goals and metrics set out for each individual associated with the role, we would actually probably get far better strategic alignment and outcomes.
Agreed. Well, I think we are officially up on time, but I do want to give Drew and Shri the opportunity to share kind of a final thought. What would be one key takeaway that you hope that the crew leaves this conversation with today? Or something important to think about heading into 2025?
Shri, do you want to go first? Or you want me to
go? Go ahead.
I think that we have a brand problem when it comes to performance management. And I would say instead of thinking of it as a process that's mired in red tape and collecting data and is there almost in a way to keep people down, I would just say, let's figure out a way to turn that around and to show people, demonstrate that the performance management process is actually benefiting people. Show the outcome, celebrate. Our performance management process gave birth to these new promotes, right? Because of these factors. And this is how they made it. Now you're letting people know the rules and how it works, right? As I started when our mission at Lever Talent, and I hope everyone can take from this, is we're all capable of much more than we could ever imagine. In performance management in general, we need to escape this notion. No one has the right to cap your potential other than you. And so if we can actually empower people to be excited about this process, contribute to this process, ask how they can perform better, we're going to win, and treat the performance management process as the system in which we do that and the lagging indicator of, we talk about feedback and coaching and all these things. Do that first. You don't even need to measure the stuff yet. Do that and you're going to get a better result than if you start with the performance management process first.
I'll reiterate what I said before, which is piggybacking on what you said. Performance review is not performance management.
Exactly.
So if you say you're doing performance management and then and what are you doing for it? And if you say I'm doing an annual review, well, you're not doing performance management, you're doing performance review. So if you're doing performance management, then the question is, why are you doing performance management? And is it to give compensation changes? Is it to decide who to promote? Or is it to actually improve the performance of the organization? Because then the answer is, okay, if that is the reason why you're doing it, then how to do performance management is a much broader set of strategy, which includes coaching and mentoring and learning and development and giving recognition and all of that stuff. There's no silver bullet for that. So my only key takeaway coming back to is performance review is not performance management.
Agreed.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Drew. Thank you, Shri. And thank you to everybody for joining today. We are going to have another AMA session. I believe it's January 14th at this same time. And I am blanking on what our topic is, Shri.
The topic is around talent mobility. and skill development and topics around that. So it's really a lot about development, and we'll be doing that with Edie Goldberg, who's an award-winning author. She's also on the Sharon board, and
Awesome.
an advisor to Engagely.
Yes, another great session to kick off the new year. Well, again, thank you everybody for joining us today. We will send out a copy of the recording. Drew just gave his email address there. Please do reach out to any of us for more information, to follow up on these conversations. I hope you connect with one another. And we hope you all have a very happy holidays and a happy new year as well. And we will see you in 2025. Thanks so much.